So hello, my name is Matt Bowker, and I manage Rhodes Scholar's virtual lecture series, and it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture. So these lectures are free and available to Rhodes Scholar participants, as well as anyone who loves to learn. This virtual program series is critical to helping us pursue our not-for-profit mission of making learning accessible to as many lifelong learners as we can, even those who do not have the physical ability or financial means to travel, or leave their homes to join us on a program. Ultimately, this series would not be possible without the support of participants just like you who have funded this project through generous donations. So please consider making a donation to Not-for-Profit Rhodes Scholar so that we can continue to provide educational experiences both in the virtual classroom and beyond. So please visit rhodesscholar.org/give to show your support with a monetary donation. Every dollar helps. So Rhodes Scholar is headquartered in Boston, but we have offices and staff around the world. And today, you'll be hearing from Tim Rogers. Tim is an educator and guide based in Bermuda, and he is a featured expert on Rhodes Scholar Program 22777, Bermuda Unveiled, Historic Forts, Secret Gardens, and more. So before we begin, a few quick notes. Tim will present for approximately 30 minutes, after which we will host a 10 to 15 minute question and answer session. Now during the session, you can submit questions using the question and answer icon located at the bottom of your screen. And then afterwards, I will read a few questions for Tim to respond. Now, should technical issues force you to miss any portion of this webinar, don't worry. We'll be adding recording of the lecture to our online virtual lecture library. And finally, at the end of the Q&A, you'll be prompted to take a very short survey. And just like on a Rhodes Scholar program, we ask that you take a few moments to fill it out. It will help us grow and improve our virtual lecture series. So let's give Tim a warm virtual welcome.
Well, thank you, Matt, and certainly a very warm welcome to everybody to Bermuda and this afternoon's lecture on the history of the botany of Bermuda. A couple of weeks ago, I had the distinct pleasure of sharing with many something of a virtual tour of Bermuda for Rhodes Scholar. And one of the places we visited was the Botanical Gardens. So today, it's one of my passions. We're going to focus on the botany of Bermuda, talking a little bit about some of the early records of plants in Bermuda, and moving on into landscape design, typical gardens in Bermuda and the challenges that we find, and then finishing off with a particular favorite of mine, Bermuda roses. So first of all, I want to just set the scene by talking about where Bermuda is located geographically. In the small inset in the top right-hand corner, you'll see a little 21 square mile island located at 32 degrees north, and so that puts us directly in line with Cape Hatteras in the Carolinas. That is 635 miles away from Bermuda. New York and Boston, just over 770 miles away, and just over 1,300 miles to Atlanta. Coming over to the main map in the center of your screen there, a beautiful map done by the Dutch cartographer by the name of Blauw in the 17th century. The large green arrow, just slightly right of center, shows you exactly where I'm coming from this afternoon. The host hotel for the Bermuda program was kind enough to provide the venue for this afternoon's talk over on the eastern side of the island. So what of the early records of Bermuda's flora? We've certainly been fairly well documented for such a tiny little island. An Englishman by the name of Henry May was on board a French vessel, La Barbotière, in 1593. That vessel was on its way from the West Indies back to Europe, and the ship and its crew were shipwrecked here for a little over 5 months. We don't know much about Henry May, but he certainly kept a fairly accurate diary of the 5 months here, and he describes Bermuda as a terrestrial paradise. He talks about the ostrich-plumed palms. That would be the Bermuda palmetto palm, we'll touch upon shortly. He talks also of cedars. There aren't actually any cedars here, there are junipers, but we'll forgive him that. And he talks about papas. We assume that those would be pawpaws, or maybe you know it better as papayas. In 1609, the fateful vessel, the Sea Venture, was taking a little bit less than 200 people from England to Jamestown, Virginia. This was the third attempt to save the Jamestown colony. The crew of that vessel was shipwrecked here for a little over 9 months. And on board were 2 diarists, Sylvester Jourdain and William Strachey. Strachey was a friend of Shakespeare and John Donne, and what he was looking for was a plot for a play. And so he boarded the vessel purely and simply to get to Virginia to talk about life in Virginia. Instead, he wrote about Bermuda in his true reportory, and Jourdain did on his discovery of the Bermudas. Jourdain talks about the healthfulest and most pleasing land a man has ever set foot on. I'm not sure healthfulest is a word, but we'll again forgive him for that. The island was established in 1612 as a British settlement, and the first governor, Governor Richard Moore, and interestingly enough, Captain John Smith, who never came here, both write about 4 timber trees to be found on the island. Not surprisingly, those trees would be used for both house building and shipbuilding, and included the Bermuda cedar, as well as 2 varieties of mangrove that grow here, the red and the black. 1689, John Dickinson, an Englishman, arrives here, and he collects 12 plant samples, which he dries, takes back to the United Kingdom, and today they reside in the Natural History Museum in London's Kensington, and those would be inside what we now know as the Sloan Herbarium. HMS Challenger arrived here in the later part of the 19th century, and 100 plant samples once again were harvested, and they were taken back to the United Kingdom and now reside in the herbarium at Kew Gardens. Ironically, an American by the name of Britton, Nathaniel Lord Britton, arrives here in 1915. You can see his curriculum vitae on your screen in front of you. A graduate of Columbia University, he co-founded the New York Botanical Gardens in the Bronx. He arrived here and hired a local man by the name of William Darrell. Between them, in 6 months, they identified and sketched 1,500 plants to be found here in Bermuda. And 3 years later, Britton published what would be really the only resource we have to this day in terms of the natural flora of Bermuda, a book of that title. And in the very center there, we have the endemic flower of Bermuda, Sisyrinchium bermudianum, or the Bermuda blue-eyed grass. Let's talk very briefly about the endemics, natives, and introductions that Britton talks about in his book. So Britton describes 17 endemic or indigenous plants in Bermuda, including what I refer to as the Trinity. First of all, the ostrich-plumed palm tree in the very center there, that would be the palmetto palm, used for roofing of our first cabins. The olive wood bark, which is a relative of the laurel tree, we'll come back to that one, and the famous Bermuda cedar, actually a juniper, and you can see that on the left-hand side of your screen bearing juniper berries. And yes, they were used for flavoring drinks and making beer. Nathaniel Britton also describes 700 native plants. Hardly surprising that most of those he identified as being present in the West Indies. The Gulf Stream heavily influences Bermuda's climate, and so the Gulf Stream would be the escalator, if you will, to move those plants to Bermuda. Now, of those 700 native plants, only 200 are vascular. Many of the plants in Bermuda are ferns, mosses, bryophytes, and the lower orders. One of the vascular plants, which is native to Bermuda, is on the right-hand side of your screen with the almost perfect circular leaf, very waxy and leathery, the sea or the bay grape, Cocolobis. Now to introduce species. Nathaniel Britton records 800 species of cultivated plants in his 1918 publication. That would include herbs, vegetables, fruits, other economic plants, as well as ornamentals. Many of those plants wouldn't have arrived too much earlier than when he came. The botanical gardens just outside of our capital, Hamilton, was set up as the public experimental gardens in 1896 under the influence of the governor, Sir William Reed. Now, he had left Bermuda at this point, but he was the one to basically set the seed for gardens which would be used for fruit and crop trials so that Bermuda could be self-sustaining. Governor Sir William Reed was well-traveled, as most of our governors were, and he imported into Bermuda most of the ficus trees that we find on the island to this very day. On the right-hand side there, one of the many introductions, we have fennel, which now has gone wild. Now, talking of governors, maybe the most influential governor in terms of plant introductions to Bermuda would be Major General Henry Lefroy. Very fine-looking, bewhiskered man there on the left-hand side. Arrived here as governor in 1871 through 1877. That's about the normal term for our colonial governors. And once again, he wrote the Botany of Bermuda in that 1870s period, even scarcer than Lord Britton's book. Now, Governor Lefroy, again well-traveled, is described as introducing more plants than almost anyone else to Bermuda. Indeed, it's suggested that hardly a week went by without an introduction during his time here. You can imagine, I suppose, the diplomatic boxes arriving in Bermuda, and along with them, slips, seeds, and cuttings of plants that he would plant at Government House and elsewhere. Governor Lefroy was a very well-respected historian, and he was very keen to commemorate the father of Bermuda, Admiral Sir George Somers, the admiral of the ship that arrived in Bermuda in 1609 on its way to Virginia. The gardens that you see in front of you are known today as the Somers Gardens and were laid out by Governor Lefroy. He chose that spot because in the period of 1609-1610, Admiral Sir George Somers planted many of the plants and seeds that were on board the Sea Venture in that ground during the brief sojourn the crew had here. Now, Major Lefroy's wife, Charlotte Dundas Lefroy, she had no formal training, but here in Bermuda, she decided to take out sketchbook, pencil, and watercolors, and produced a very fine set of watercolors, many of which are in private hands, many of also that belong to the Bermuda National Trust. And just a few short years ago, a set of stamps were issued to commemorate Lady Lefroy's floral decorations. And there we have Clitoria, otherwise known as the Darwin or butterfly pea. I grow it in my own garden. It's a beautiful vine, and you can see an example, a living example of the flower there on the right-hand side of the image. 1883 really puts Bermuda on the map when Princess Louise, one of Queen Victoria's daughters, comes to visit Bermuda as a tourist. And so it's hardly surprising that many illustrators at that point decide to jump on the bandwagon and start producing saleable images, anything from prints to postcards to books. And I think maybe one of the finest would be May Middleton, that published in the early 20th century, as you can see on the left there, the flowers of Bermuda. One of the illustrations from inside on your right there, a bryophyllum known as the life plant or floppers. One of the other groups of people that produced the most gorgeous tourist images, if you will, were Ethel and Catherine Tucker, the Tucker sisters as they were known. They ran a small tea room just on the outskirts of the city of Hamilton, and once again sold every tourist item you can imagine in the 1920s, 1930s. And I think these two postcards evoke the sense of what a Bermuda garden should really look like. I now want to talk about one of the other key players in the flora of Bermuda, William Bennett Perrott. His descendants came to Bermuda from France via New Rochelle, New York, where so many of the Huguenot families moved, and then arrived in the 19th century in Bermuda. William Bennett Perrott, the postmaster for the island at that time, owned a 4-acre estate called Parleville. It was literally located on the outskirts of the present-day city of Hamilton. He diversified from postmastering into a commercial orchard for oranges, lemons, limes, and grapefruits, and introduced several varieties. He was also a very keen ornamental gardener. I rather warmed to William Bennett. Many people complained that he was more likely to be found in his garden than anywhere else. One of the plants that he introduced to Bermuda was from the island of Demerara, now called Guyana, and that was a very large rubber tree to be found on the outskirts of the city of Hamilton. It's an absolute monster of a tree. He also introduced, amongst many others, the Jamaican caper tree, the fruits of which can be used very similar to the capers that we would use in a Caesar dressing. So in total, we now number over 9,000 species of exotic introductions to Bermuda, many from the West Indies, but also many from Asia and Australasia. Many of them were introduced by the governors of Bermuda and many of the seafaring captains that went to the Far East bringing cargoes back to Bermuda. Most of these plants were introduced in the mid to late 19th century. On your far left-hand side there, we have a commercial crop, the Japanese plum, known as the loquat. On the far right, a medicinal plant called the Match Me If You Can. That is a plant which is closely related to the chenille plant that many grow as an annual in their beds. And just about coming into flower in the dead center of the picture, introduced in 1870, we have Delonix regia, the royal poinciana, or the flamboyant tree. So as I move into talking a little bit about Bermuda gardens and the challenges that we have to overcome, I want to very briefly touch upon the geology of Bermuda, because if you'll pardon the pun, it really is the bedrock of our gardens. So in this very simplified diagram, we start off at the bottom of your screen there with the seamount, or the volcano that began Bermuda. Bermuda was created during the Cretaceous period. So we're talking about 120 to 60 million years ago. That volcano sprang up on the mid-Atlantic ridge, some 1,300 miles to the east of where we sit today, heading towards Europe. As seafloor spreading caused the volcano to drift on the North American plate, the tectonic plate, so it became extinct. And so around the shoulders of that volcano developed a living coral reef. The living organisms of that reef being brought to the volcano by the development of the Gulf Stream around this time period. And so the block or brick-like structures you see on the shoulders of the volcano would represent the extinct volcano, I apologize, the extinct coral reef turned into stratified limestone. We then see multiple layers of limestone as Bermuda has gone into a glacial and an interglacial period as the island has grown and as the island has shrunk below sea level. Today, at the very top of the screen there, we have dunes that make up the current island. We are a very undulating island, albeit that we only rise at our highest to 264 feet above sea level. And we have a fringing reef that surrounds Bermuda. So we really are looking at a very young island made up almost exclusively of coral reef and calcareous material. So if we look at the image at the top right-hand corner of your screen there, that is one of the current coral reefs in Bermuda. Interestingly enough, it basically has the same shape if you were flying above Bermuda today as the island. And so I want you to imagine that that reef represents the island, made up of a volcanic base on top of which you've got deposition of calcareous material, calcium carbonate, of marine coral reef origin. Over the top of that coral island, we have a limestone cap, which is stratified. And everywhere you go in Bermuda, you can see that limestone layer, as you can see in the bottom right hand of your screen. So what does this mean practically for the gardener in Bermuda? First of all, we are challenged with having very thin soils, often less than 18 inches thick. Now, in the valleys of Bermuda, you may get soils as deep as 3 feet, but there aren't that many valleys within Bermuda, and so the average gardener, both commercial and private, is working with 18 inches of soil. Made up of sand, the soil is highly calcareous. We really are gardening on sand. And the pH is really quite alkali, in the range of 8 to 8.2. That's not beyond the bounds for most plants, but obviously acid-loving plants are just not going to grow in Bermuda. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, not much of any of those, and so the soils are extremely poor in terms of nutrients. Given our marine origins, the soil is very, very salty, which is going to cause something of an osmotic pressure for the plants growing. There is very little in the way of water retention in Bermuda. There is little to no organic matter. We have no standing water whatsoever in Bermuda. That's one of our unique features. And so plants have got to desperately try and source water deeper down, or manage to subsist on what rainfall we get, that I'll come back to in a moment. In terms of critters, the myofauna in our soil, because of how calcareous the soil is, how little organic matter, we have very little in the way of little critters living in our soil. A lot of sun, very high insolation rates, and a significant amount of wind throughout most of the year. So those are the main challenges for the Bermuda gardener. On the flip side, we average about 60 inches of rain per year. We don't have a wet or a dry season, so the rain is spread evenly throughout the year, which certainly is highly beneficial for the plants in terms of their not being stressed out at any particular time of year. In terms of plant zoning, we fall into zone 11. That's along with the very southern tip of Florida. We have a very mild climate. In fact, zone 11 identifies temperatures not getting below 45 degrees. In fact, we rarely see temperatures dipping below 50 degrees, and indeed rarely see temperatures above 85. And so it's a mild and equable climate. As I mentioned earlier, with both the native and the exotic plants of Bermuda, the gardener in Bermuda has over a variety of 10,000 plants to choose from. So what about landscape design Bermuda style? I have to say that if you are envisaging in Bermuda the fabulous gardens of Scotland, France, many other places in the world that you're familiar with, I don't think you'll be disappointed, but you would not expect to see something quite that grand. Bermuda Gardens really have some quite unique features, and I want to just touch upon a few of those. What would you expect to see? Well, let's start off with Ambrose Webster. He was from Massachusetts. He was one of the modernist painters that came to Bermuda in the late early 1900s, one of the leaders of the Fauvism movement. And inset there, we have a couple of close-up images of his descriptions of Bermuda Gardens. Much like the Fauvism school, I think I could honestly categorize a Bermuda garden as being dense, vibrant, lush, and wild. 7 features I want to briefly go through. Bermuda gardens are typified by walls and hedges, naturalistic windbreaks. We utilize walled gardens, rooms. We use a lot of raised beds. We have quite a few quarry gardens, and we utilize our ruins. Well, I think everybody is well aware that the Englishman loves their walls and their hedges to define their boundaries, their castles, if you will. There is barely a garden in Bermuda which is not bound by walls, hedges, or walls and hedges. They will, of course, ameliorate some of the effects of salt and wind, as well as providing privacy. Many of the hedging plants in Bermuda are imported. On the top left-hand corner there, we have Pittosporum tabarum, the Japanese yew. And over on the right-hand side there, we actually have a South African native known as heath firecracker, and a beautiful example of a Bermuda stone wall. Naturalistic windbreaks. Many of us in our gardens plant a series of walls, if you will, out of natural plants to create an ever more refined space to plant more tender plants away from wind and salt. Top right-hand corner, we have what's often known as Indian hawthorn. It comes in white and pink and often looks like cherry or apple blossom. Raphiolepis, very waxy and leathery leaves, very dense and ideal for providing a naturalistic windbreak. At the bottom of your screen there, we have one of Bermuda's Trinity. I mentioned the 3 indigenous trees of the island. There we have olive wood or olive wood bark, and I think you can clearly see in the image there, very waxy, very leathery, very resistant to salt and wind, perfect for using as a windbreak. Walled gardens. Now, once again, if you imagine coming to Bermuda to see the typical walled gardens that I'm familiar with from the United Kingdom, or indeed the United States or Canada, well, not typical of Bermuda. Simply put, because we are in the hurricane zone. June to December, we are likely to experience hurricanes, although indeed they come through quite rarely to Bermuda. Nonetheless, we don't tend to build our wall gardens much more than 5 feet tall. But what it does do is to create that room, if you will, acting as a wind and a salt break. In the image on your screen there, I hope you can clearly see the balustrading at the top of the wall there, which reduces further any potential wind damage from hurricanes, but still will act very nicely to protect the plants within that beautiful private walled garden. You might have been wondering what I meant by rooms in our gardens. Many people in Bermuda create these series of rooms using those hedging plants so that you create ever a more rarefied atmosphere as you move through your garden. the prevailing winds that do damage to our gardens come from the north. And so if you look at the diagram on the left-hand side of your screen, we've created a room there in which there's going to be some wind getting in. So you can plant plants inside of there which are protected by the first batch of hedges, if you will. But then as you move into the next room through more hedges, then you're going to have plants which are less tolerant of wind and salt, moving through into the third and final garden in that diagrammatic representation, to an area where you can plant plants which are even less tolerant of the salt and wind that Bermuda is going to throw at it. These beautiful rooms, used so effectively by Bermuda gardeners, not only, of course, provide a wind and salt break, but also provide a sense of anticipation as you move into the next room. With the very thin calcareous soils, we want to enrich those soils, and so we then also raise those gardens up with wooden boxes or limestone walls to create the raised beds that you see in this illustration. Again, very common. We've quarried limestone from the island for 4 centuries, and here you can quite clearly see the beautiful sort of Fauvist idea of a quarry garden. And we've utilized ruins like the building on the left, which is an original food larder or a buttery. On the right there, you might just about be able to pick out that buttery enveloped by Hyla Sirius, the night-blooming cactus. So very briefly, just to finish off, roses. Bermuda has had roses here since the arrival of the ship in 1609. Those roses would have been the French roses, the Rosa gallica. Why? Well, those roses were known as medicinals. In 1639, a Spaniard talks about every garden in Bermuda having roses. And indeed, a witchcraft trial in 1653, the main focus was a rose that disappeared. We have quite a number of roses in Bermuda called mysteries, roses that you wouldn't expect to find anywhere else in the world. And they haven't drifted far away from the roses that, the French roses, the Rosa gallicas. Bermuda wind chimes, one of the patio roses on the left, and Emmy Gray on the right. One of my personal favorites, again, not drifted too far away from the apothecary's rose. Here, Rosa Damascena. Here we have the St. David's rose, named after one of our counties or parishes. And last, but by no means least, the Smith's Parish rose, again, another typical Bermuda rose. It's a very interesting rose. At certain times of year, as you can see on the bottom right there, you get white and red roses or pink roses on the bush at the same time. At this time of year, I'd expect to find in my rose gardens the rose looking, as you see on the left there, almost like a barber's pole with a mixture of white and pink roses on the same flower. Quite gorgeous. Well, I hand over to Matt for any questions.
Thanks, Tim. So just a reminder, you can submit questions using the question and answer icon located at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so our first few questions are about invasive species. So our first question is from Benita. She asks, have any invasive plant species been introduced over the years that have overran the native vegetation?
That is an excellent question, and it's one of our biggest concerns on island. Everything grows here within reason, and there are several species which have taken over. Morning glory would be one. Many people tend morning glory in their gardens in North America, but here it almost behaves like kudzu. It completely envelops Bermuda. We even have kudzu, and there's been legal action taken against residents recently to get them to remove that infamous Japanese plant. Anyone that's familiar with Florida would be familiar with Shynus terebinthifolium, the Mexican or Brazil pepper, which has taken over the island as well. So yes, Benita, we've got several invasive species that we regularly have to hack back.
Okay, Mark has a question. He asks, given the thin layer of soil and nutrient deficiencies, has good soil been imported during the past century to bulk up better growing conditions?
Another great question. The last time soil was imported to Bermuda was about 50 years ago, 50 years ago. And that was a time, I think, where nobody really thought anything of it. What it introduced to Bermuda was a nematode, which affected our onion crop, which Bermuda, of course, is famous for the onion. And so that was the last time that we imported soil. We do bring in potting soil, which has had to be sterilized. But apart from that, we typically all compost in our gardens and do our level best to try and ameliorate the very poor soil that we do have.
Thank you. Linda asks, why were so many exotic plants introduced to Bermuda? Or was this practice in general going throughout the Caribbean?
It's true to say that throughout the Caribbean region, and of course so many of those islands were British protectorates, and so these governors seemed to sort of island hop, and so each place they went, they took the next batch of plants with them. Bermuda does not need to be beautified by the exotics that we brought in. It's beautiful enough with its native species, but it just seemed to be a hankering of the governors and ship's captains to, they just had to have something that wasn't natural to Bermuda.
In terms of the pollinators, Andrew asks, are there native insect pollinators?
Good question. We have bees in Bermuda in great profusion. We have been lucky enough not to see the demise of the honeybee, as so many places have, and so they help to pollinate our commercial as well as our garden plants. We also have the little Puerto Rican coqui, the little whistling frogs that they pollinate. And during the summer, we have bats that pollinate many of our plants as well. So yeah, quite a number of insects which achieve the necessary pollination.
Sue says she doesn't have a question. She just wants to say, I enjoyed the trip with you in 2018. So,
oh,
hello
great.
from Sue.
Thanks, Sue.
So, about the roses. Is the two-colored rose a result of leaky genes or something environmental? This is a question from Patricia.
I love the expression leaky genes. I must use that one. Yeah, the court is out on exactly why, but I think it's fair to assume that it is a hybrid of a red and a white rose, and so the recessive gene occasionally comes out in that rose. Quite a number of our roses don't typically breed true throughout the year. They're very environmentally controlled, so temperature will have a major effect on how that rose will look during the year, and also the soil that we plant them in. So if we modify the soil, the rose can look quite different. Madame Lombard is a classic where it can be pink in calcareous soil and quite a deep velvet red in something more acidic.
And Michelle wants to know if those roses are growing most and best in the most interior sheltered gardens or not.
That's a great question. Certainly, our roses are quite salt tolerant, but my rose gardens certainly are well protected by a series of the naturalistic windbreaks made up of the Indian hawthorn, the Raphiolepis. They certainly do a lot better if they're protected from the salt and the wind. But just to maybe upset everybody, and I maybe shouldn't do that, one thing we don't have in Bermuda: mildew, mites, Japanese beetle, or black spots. So all the challenges that rosarians have in North America, we are spared. So maybe some of the salt and the wind actually benefit us or our roses.
Um, so you have a garden, Tim, correct?
Yes, correct.
What is your favorite part of your garden? What has been the most challenging thing to grow in your garden?
Yes, I garden about an acre. It's close to the water, and so the challenge has been to create these windbreaks. The most challenging has been to create rooms and windbreaks where I can grow plants that really shouldn't grow where I live. But when I first came to the island 30 years ago, my wife said, "Oh, roses are the easiest thing in the world to grow. All you do is take a cutting, shove it in the ground, and it roots." And I said, "Yeah, right." As always, she was proven right. I've cultivated, at this point, nearly 30 varieties of rose and many more than that in terms of multiples within the garden. So it's my joy is to tend my rose gardens.
What is the best season to visit Bermuda in and enjoy the gardens?
Well, we don't really have seasons as such, Matt, but certainly April and May are wonderful floristically, as are October and November. And so it's hardly surprising many of the Rhodes Scholar trips take place at that time. But yeah, April, May, into June, October, November are definitely the best.
Okay, and Kathleen asks, is there anything done to increase the meiofauna, a word I just learned from you? That's what she says specifically. So is there anything done to increase the meiofauna? And could you remind us what meiofauna is?
Yeah, very simply put, the tiny little critters that live in the soil. Everything from nematodes to weevils, bugs basically, bacteria. All of these creatures live in the between the sand grains, the interstices, and help to benefit the soil. And the simple answer is no. We are very shy of importing anything into Bermuda which might have a deleterious effect on the soil, plants, and everything else. And so we simply make do without.
And Fran wants to know, what is the history of the oleander and jasmine on the island?
That's a good question. Yeah, we have such an accurate record of almost everything in Bermuda. And if memory serves me, 1783, we have a bill of lading from a ship that came in from North Carolina, bringing with it the South Sea Island rose, which is otherwise known as the oleander. It came with a note, planted as a hedge. And so that's the sort of time period in the history. And certainly my property is bounded by an oleander hedge. It blooms for quite a few months of the year and makes a great salt-tolerant, wind-tolerant hedge. Jasmine, we grow the Confederate jasmine, and that does very well here, but it's not one of our most common plants. As far as hedging, it's oleander and hibiscus, which would be the primary hedging, flowering hedging plants.
Have any deciduous bushes or even trees of North American origin been imported?
Certainly some North American species have been brought in, everything from goldenrod through blackberry irises from places like Illinois. Some deciduous trees, but oftentimes anything that's deciduous in North America is not deciduous here. There just isn't that trigger for them to drop their leaves. And in fact, that brings up with roses. Most of my roses bloom for 12 months of the year, which puts a lot of stress on them. So hybrid tea roses, grafted roses, would never work here. They burn themselves out after 4 or 5 years. So I'm growing, as we all do here, own root roses that can stand to bloom 12 months of the year and for, on average, 20 to 30 years.
Wow. A few questions left. So Betty asks, how will global warming related sea level rise affect the island in general and its soil suitability for current plants?
Yeah, good question. We have seen a rise in sea level of 18 inches in the last 50 years, representing 3 feet of shoreline lost. That has had a profound effect on the native flora of Bermuda. I've seen in 3 decades. Plants along the shoreline become much more salt-loving plants, like mangroves have been proliferating more in 30 years than prior to that. And I think certainly we're going to have to be more cognizant of the fact that we're going to have to grow more salt-tolerant plants as sea level will start to creep up into higher ground, if you will. Rising temperatures on island as well. I mean, we're seeing, again, we don't get much above 85 degrees, but we're slowly but surely seeing, half a degree rise in temperature, maybe every 5 to 10 years. And so some of the marginal plants are probably not going to be able to grow in Bermuda in the next century.
All right. Well, Tim, I think that's all the time we have today for questions, but thank you very much. And if you're interested in learning more about Bermuda, please explore program 22777. It's a Rhodes Scholar program taking you across the island. And I'd also like to thank my producer, Megan, who's behind the scenes, but without her, both Tim and I would be lost. So big shout out to Megan, who's working behind the scenes. And then finally, I'm excited to announce that this week we've introduced a new collection of Rhodes Scholar programs called Adventures Online. So right now, if you go to our website, you can see 4 programs, and they range from 1 day to multi-days. So I encourage you to explore those programs and look out for more online adventures coming. And thank you very much, Tim. And thank you again to everybody that tuned in today.
Thanks for joining me, everyone. Have a blessed day.